Meg is someone that I've worked with on the label side of things, but also has been in music and tech for quite some time now, and obviously we'll get into that. So I think the best way to start is just for you to kind of talk about your start in both music and tech, how you first got interested, or you first started developing that passion, and kind of the beginnings of what we'll get into, which is Integral and SymphonyOS.
Yeah, for sure. Man, I guess my story starts in like 2014, 2015. I was a kid studying computer science at the University of Washington. And I was in school during the time of like data science, machine learning, AI really becoming the talk of the town, which funny enough in 2022 today, everyone's talking about AI, like AI generated photos and all of that. But
Right.
back in that time, like that was a hot topic for a lot of companies. And seeing that, I was always like, all right, cool. There's a big path for me here to go to Silicon Valley and follow that traditional tech route. But it was also the same time, I'm sure you remember, where like Noise was in the streets of Atlanta talking to Migos and Young Thug, like Noisy Vice documentaries.
Right.
Like SoundCloud was becoming super big. I remember when Lil Yachty dropped One Night and like it went crazy, and Young Lean had his little moment at that time as well. And I was like, yo, this is like very interesting that music is like not being disrupted necessarily, but the discovery point for music was changing to the internet. And so seeing that, and also just being like the tech nerd I was like, yo, like there has to be a place for more tech in the music space, and like there have to be ways for artists to use technology in deeper ways, kind of like tech companies are. And so instead of like going to Silicon Valley doing that whole thing, like the year before my last year of classes, I came down to Internet Hulu in LA just to get closer to the scene. Met some folks out here just like by like networking and being outside, and we all ended up starting a company called Integral Studio by the end of that summer. And the funny story is like I had 1 year classes left, and so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna start this company. I went back up to Washington to like tell my parents I'm moving down to LA and dropping out. They're like, you are not dropping out at all. You have to come back home. And I was like, all right, if I finessed my last year of classes and still graduated, would you guys let me move to LA? And they're like, all right, as long as you finish your classes. So our first year of Integral, like we got to work with folks like SZA and a bunch of these major label artists, but I was flying back up for midterms, like honestly for 1 day or 2 days at a time, and flying back down just because I was like so committed to like trying to figure out this music stuff.
Right.
But yeah, it just started out with us building websites for artists. That's like how our journey really started, like getting called in to build cool experiences, and it just kind of compounded from there.
And so to clarify, you went to University of Washington and you studied computer science?
I did.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what helped you initially with Integral in terms of building websites for artists. And this is around 2017-ish?
Yeah, 2016, 2017.
2017?
It was like before like the Instagramification, I guess, of like everything in music, because I feel like artist websites still had like a prominent point at that time. I feel like since then the websites have become less important. It's been like all link in bios and
I was
things
gonna say
like that.
it's mostly link in bio stuff now. Right?
Exactly. Around that time it was like an artist could drop a sick website and fans would still go to it and be like, yo, this is crazy,
Right. And so that's kind of how sorry, is it Integral or
Integral, whatever, people
Either
say
one?
different things, whatever you want to say.
So that's how Integral started. How did you guys scale that business? And obviously, right, music tech, that was kind of at the, like you kind of noted, the beginning point of when music tech really started to accelerate. How did you guys keep up with the trends, and what were you guys doing that kind of attracted a lot of attention your way in terms of artists wanting to work with you?
Yeah, it was honestly very organic. So like to give some context, like one of my co-founders, Vlad, was previously Metro Boomin's tour manager.
Okay.
And so he knew about the tour business, obviously through Metro, just got to meet a lot of artists. So he understood how artists thought about technology and things like that. And then my other co-founder, Chuka, was previously Childish Gambino and Mac Miller's creative director. So he'd been in like the workflow of like designing, developing things for artists, but he'd also been previously at Techstars as like a hacker in residence. So he had a little bit of tech background. And I was like the tech nerd in the middle, like, oh, let's work with artists. But basically, like, we were just, the whole thesis of the company initially was like, let's just take the dopest things we saw in technology happening at the time and bring it to artist websites.
Right.
And so I remember like the first thing we did was like for SZA, right? We built this like crazy website for her where fans could go on and place stems from our upcoming single with Travis Scott, Love Galore, before it actually came out.
Wow.
And so it was like just like a very unique experience just to like see how fans are interacting with the music before it came out. And I was even seeing fans like making SoundCloud remixes out of the stems we gave them before the song had come out, just like their own interpretation of the song. So seeing that, we're like, all right, cool. There's clearly a space here for this like level of fan artist engagement that like is very different from the traditional rollout cycle. And so the second thing we worked on was actually through Rock Nation with Big Sean. Like we were messing around with augmented reality. Like I found this random like development toolkit that we could build AR into an app somehow. And so we went to Rock Nation. We're like, yo, like we know Big Sean is about to drop this album. I decided we should do essentially what would now be considered an NFT almost, but we should make it so that anyone that bought a physical album could scan the inside of the album and see exclusive content behind the scenes only if they bought the physical. And so like we got the chance to do that with that team, and like that was a crazy experience. But I feel like a lot of it was really just like seeing what was coming out and like just nerding out about it and trying to figure out ways where it makes sense in a more musical fan oriented context, and just doing that over and over again. I think like very quickly, just like in the LA scene especially, being able to do that and just like show work for it, I feel like people started looking at us as like, all right, these guys are like the nerdy cool tech dudes that like know how to build cool experiences.
For sure.
And we were able to kind of ride that up until, you know, everything we've been doing thus far.
Awesome. Yeah. And speaking of which, you know, I think what's really cool is that I read about the Big Sean thing, obviously, and I know that it's like something that you guys take pride in is that you are obviously like very technologically skilled, but also very innovative. And I read, I mean, like, I don't know if you guys take this claim yourselves, but online, right, some people say that you were one of the first people to do merch bundling for artists in terms of helping their album sales. I don't know if that's true, if you want to like talk a little bit about that as well.
It was a finesse. It was all a finesse, to be honest. Like that whole era of like music was a finesse. But I don't know. I think what it was it was with Travis's team actually for Birds in the Trap. Like Travis has been one of those artists that like has always been ahead in terms of like thinking about sales and fan engagement. But like back in that day, I remember his team being like, yo, like we see this loophole in the RIA like certification things where like we could sell a piece of merchandise with an album and it still counts as a unit. And so basically what we did was we set up the e-commerce store and just like ran mad ads to it to help boost those like kind of like first week sales. So we did that for a few artists, you know, a few times before like they closed that loophole. But yeah, it was definitely just like, I feel like you have windows in music where like things hit really heavily until they either get diluted or die down. We saw it with TikTok too, right? The Lil Nas X's, the boxes, like those lasted. There was like a 6 month to 1 year window where those could happen, and now like you rarely have that level of like hit coming out of TikTok. And so from the bundling perspective, like we were just like, all right, we can finesse this with ads. Let's help these guys set up a merch store and just finesse it with ads. And like that window, we were kind of like running amok while I was running.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I do want to move on to SymphonyOS at some point, but I quickly want to ask, just because I'm honestly not totally aware myself, I know with Integral, you guys have done some work with Web3, or at least with like advising on the transition from Web 2 to Web 3. Can you talk a little bit about that, some of the projects you've worked on there, and kind of your foresight into the next stage of music marketing with regards to Web 3?
Yeah. It's an interesting space. I feel like there's obviously like we're in like a very deep crypto winter right now, like a bear market. But I think for us, it was always like, how do we use Web3 in a way and the unique capabilities of Web3, knowing what we know about fan engagement and marketing. So like some of the work we've done, we've helped incubate a few projects with some folks. Like there's some folks in music especially that have started to transition into Web3 and trying to find ways to like do unique things. So we've been like hand holding some folks into Web3. Like Metro, for example, I don't know if y'all saw one of these music videos he just dropped off his album has like a screenshot of like a NFT wallet with some like Thugbirds or something like that in there. So my business partner like kind of got that to happen where he hit up like the Thugbirds team, was like, yo, we got Metro tapped in. Let's, airdrop him a Thugbird and like put it in the actual thing. And like, you know, those are the kinds of things that we jumped in with into Web3. But I think especially with like thinking about Web3 going into the future, right? To me, it just represents a new way of monetization of fandom. I think we're still, personally at least, we're still a little bits away from like having a killer application that makes every fan want to have a wallet. I think that'll come with time.
Yep.
But I think now, like, whereas before, like, you could judge a super fan by like, all right, cool, a super fan spent $100 in a year. That was like the always traditional like outlook on a super fan. Web3 gives you a new perspective of a super fan, where it's like, all right, these folks like really, really love the artist to the point where they're willing to collect a piece of work and claim it forever. I think like that's where Web3 will really play an impact, especially as it relates to marketing and like knowing who your base is for an artist.
Definitely. And I think right, that's been the biggest talking point for the transition to Web3 in terms of music, is that it will be really heavily centered around the participation of the super fan, and naturally everyone's trying to find different ways to monetize that or how to best engage with them. And I know SymphonyOS does a really great job of identifying either potential super fans or just getting in touch with those fans when an artist drops new music. So can you talk a little bit about the origins of SymphonyOS, because it started within Integral, if I'm not mistaken?
Yep.
And then kind of what is so special about SymphonyOS in terms of music marketing for the next generation of artists?
Yeah, for sure. So Symphony was an idea we incubated probably starting in 2018. Like at that time, right, we kind of transitioned out of websites into doing digital marketing for labels. So we get hit up by a bunch of labels, a bunch of artists to do their rollouts. But the way we did marketing, kind of the reason we got some sort of cachet, I guess, in the marketing space is we're very nuanced on audience targeting. And so we would for real go in to Ads Manager and set up 200 to 300 audiences by hand, because we didn't have any technology at that point in time. So if you think about an Instagram account, right, or a Facebook, there's all these actions, like a fan that liked a post or shared a post, saved a post, clicked on links, all these minute actions a fan can take. And the traditional targeting approach is all right, let's just take all these fans and put them into one set of targeting. But what we were doing was we're actually taking each of these actions and making an individual audience for all of them. And then for every country in the world, based on where the fan base was, we'd make an individual audience lookalike for all of those as well. So just doing that by hand, right, it would take us honestly a week sometimes to spin up a campaign to run Instagram ads or Facebook ads. And our team was just sick of it. Our marketing team was this is too much work for us. We got to figure out a way to optimize this. And so around that time, I was all right, let me see if I can hack together some things with the Facebook API. And that's kind of how it started out, right? Just streamlining workflows. Then as we got deeper and deeper into it, and in 2020, we ended up getting our own label partnership through Sony, and all of us started managing artists as well. And so we're now in a place where we're trying to do this for clients as well as our own artists, and just trying to cobble together the current status quo of tools that the industry had. There was the Chartmetrics of the world, which collect amazing data, but don't give you too much actionability on that data. And there's the feature FMs, just link in bio platforms, which also very important for an artist to have and have a lot of great data, but don't really let you act on it. And then the marketing steps you have to take, whether it's setting up ads or figuring out how to actually run the ads and things like that. It was always very fragmented for us included. It was always a multi-step process. And so in 2020, we were all right, why don't we just build our own bots and scrapers? Why don't we just track the data ourselves and then build our own link in bio? It's pretty straightforward. And then once that data is in one place, then we can automate the audience targeting even deeper than having to cobble together all these data sources.
Right.
So that's really the goal of Symphony is if the data is all in one place across the board, then you can build applications on top that talk to that data in particular. And hopefully when you're doing paid marketing, it's much more concise and targeted than just hoping, kind of spraying and praying.
Right. I think that's a key point there that I would love for you to expand on. So can you, just for the average listener, compare what your typical Instagram ads campaign fares versus a SymphonyOS targeted ads campaign?
Yeah. I think it's important too to talk about what targeting means, right?
Right.
When it comes to these ads platforms, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, the goal is how do I find someone that's going to engage with what I'm putting in front of them most consistently?
Right.
Because there's always people scrolling on these platforms that are always seeing some sorts of ads. And so when you do something like a boost post, or even go into Ads Manager and create this standard Facebook ads audiences that they give you, what Facebook is doing is making very generic ads, very generic audiences based on, I would say lowest common denominators, right? If the goal of anyone on Facebook Ads Manager is to drive link clicks, and they'll make audiences for that. But the action of finding a new fan for music is very particular compared to just driving link clicks. And so when we're building out these audiences, they're more so attuned towards folks that have an interest in Spotify, but also have an interest in consuming music. So that's, I would say, the biggest difference between our targeting and more the traditional tools that are out there. There's a lot of ads automation platforms, but no one really made something that's finding audiences that are into music and want to consume music. So something Symphony might get from a numbers perspective, right? You might run an ad campaign on Instagram boost posts for 10, 20 cents a click. But there's just a lot of holes in that targeting. It's bringing a lot of people that won't stick around and engage. Whereas Symphony might be like 15 to 25 cents, maybe a little bit more expensive per cost per click, but it's much more targeted when it does find those people. So every dollar is going farther in terms of real engaged, sticky fans.
Right. And is there data that you can see if you're running a campaign that tracks kind of the I guess it's a bad way to say it, but like the length that a fan will stay with the artist? Is there kind of ways you can test that or see that with some of these campaigns?
One thing we look at is like the monthly listeners to follower ratio. So we see sometimes like monthly listeners can be impacted by a lot of different metrics, like or just things like algorithmic playlists, editorial, all of that. But what we see is that once we're running ads on the Symphony versus just not running ads at all, the monthly listeners might go up, but the the monthly listener to follower ratio goes down when you're not running ads. But with Symphony ads, they grow proportionally. So what we're seeing is that these people are coming in, they're listening and adding to the monthly listener account, but they're also following on Spotify, which is, that means they're going to be sticking around and getting the release radar on playlists, things like that.
Definitely.
So those are kind of the metrics we tend to look at when we try and gauge efficacy of these campaigns.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And I think that's, that's making use of data that I think some people might tend to overlook sometimes or not place as much importance on. One other thing I want to ask you about is just kind of about the importance of audience data. I think that it's become abundantly clear in the last, 5-6 years that is the best indicator of how to best spend your marketing dollars in terms of trying to attract new audiences. What do you think is the future of audience data, and in the sense of privacy laws are getting pretty strict on a lot of these platforms, and a lot of these APIs are turning private? Do you think that that's going to become a challenge for companies like SymphonyOS and other companies that kind of their entire business model revolves around attracting new audiences? What do you kind of see in the future of that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting, complicated situation for a lot of advertising companies, right? Because you're always
beyond music too.
Beyond music,
general,
right? Even I remember when GDPR came into place in the EU, and Facebook wasn't able to target as effectively anymore. So all the costs went up. We were sick. All the costs doubled or something for at least a few months. And then Facebook kind of updated some things and cleaned it up. But I think there's always going to be this push and pull between consumers not wanting to give up data and businesses wanting data.
Right.
But I think there's ways of getting clear, conscientious, almost like a permission to provide data when the fan wants to give it, right? For example, one thing we're intending to look at and potentially build out is the ability for fans to opt in for updates from the artist, whatever they may be, right? Maybe it's a new song, maybe it's a tour ticket, maybe it's just a one-to-one communication style tool. But in those cases, right, the fan wants to give that information to the artist, hopefully, their email, their phone number, their information. And I think that's when, there's a clear kind of above board white line of all right, cool. This fan wants to give that data, so the artist should be able to use it. I think there's a lot of ways too of there's a lot of ways of getting data that tend to exist in this industry. And we've even seen labels, not going to name any labels, but we've seen a lot of folks use random data sources. I get random emails all the time from music marketing companies that somehow scrape my email from somewhere.
Right.
So I think those things, especially as more of these privacy laws go into place, they'll hopefully slow down a little bit, and more of these explicit fan-driven interactions that give artists data are the ones that'll continue to succeed.
Gotcha, definitely. And I also want to ask about the future of targeting in general in terms of what content is used to target, right? Because right now, I think for the most part, if you're running an ad on a piece of content for a new audience, it's an out now post, or it's a pre-save post. I would have to imagine at a certain point, the market must get a little oversaturated with people with, cool looking content, asking people to go listen to their song, to go follow them on Spotify. Do you see there being in the near future any kind of shift in the kind of content we use to market ourselves, or for artists to market themselves? Or is this kind of around to stay for the near future?
I think it's there's always going to be a certain point where we reach a saturation of people talking about their music or trying to promote their music.
Right.
I think that's offset by just the growth in the internet overall, right? Instagram is now 1 billion plus people. There's artists running ads that we'll never see because they're only running ads in India or wherever they're running ads in.
Right.
So I think the growth of the internet kind of helps with that. I think it's proportional to how many artists there are as well. Like as the internet grows, there's more artists trying to promote their music, but there's also more fans to consume that music. I think on the other end, just overall, this kind of like, I've just seen a push away from like this highly produced content type of world that we were in like in 2018, 2019 to more short form content, right?
Yep.
Like fans, like, artists like being at home recording a cover or an acoustic version of their song, or just singing along to the song they're going to release, or just making it much more personable.
Definitely.
I think that's where we're going to start seeing more and more content start going. And I think it makes sense because I think fans are becoming smarter. They're more hyper aware of when something is being marketed to them, especially because like everything is marketing now, right? You can't scroll on Instagram 2 times until you see an ad. So I think fans are starting to pick that up as well. And artists are becoming a little bit smarter too of like what to promote from that side. I think that world of just like a billboard on every third post on Instagram is going to slow down, and it's going to be more like, all right, like enter the artist world, know more about the artist, and then the music comes, not secondary, but the music comes after you know who the artist is as a person almost.
Definitely. And in terms of, I think that plays into artist development, right? Like kind of taking fans along with the artist as the musicianship of the artist grows, so does their personality, so does their fan audiences. What would your recommendation be to new artists or developing artists in terms of expanding their fan base if they know that they have their social game down, let's say, right, but they need help with the marketing side? What key indicators do you think are most important in terms of looking at new audiences to reach from an artist perspective, given the amount of data that they have available now through Spotify for artists and through advertising companies or through marketing companies like SymphonyOS?
Yeah, I think that the beauty is that there's an abundance of data right now, like Spotify, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, SoundCloud, all these platforms generate data. And so one thing I think about a lot is like the overlap of data, right? Like your top 10 on Spotify might be very different than your top 10 on YouTube in terms of countries, but maybe the 11th one is the same across all of them. So I think that's a very interesting indicator for like, all right, like clearly there's fandom in these countries or locations where fans are consuming your content across the board when you put it out. And so when I think about marketing from that perspective, and one thing we're also trying to build out into the platform itself is almost like an overlap calculator, right? Like seeing where the overlaps are across all these platforms and then running marketing specifically in those places. Maybe it's not the US, maybe it's like Sweden, right? Maybe Sweden has like fans are really mess with your music and they're showing through and following you, consuming on these different content platforms. It doesn't make sense not to market to Sweden if you're seeing that. So I think like as the world gets more globalized, as music reaches farther places, I think it's important for artists to keep that in mind, right? There's obviously touring-oriented fan bases where an artist can tour and sell merchandise, things like that, but it's a really big world. And what was it, Lollapalooza just happened in, I think, like Argentina, and it was like hella fans came through.
Right.
India is having, I think, just had one of its biggest concerts with like 50,000 people that came through in Mumbai. The world of music is becoming more globalized, so I think the days of artists just marketing to like LA, New York, Atlanta, Miami, I think those are slowing down, and now we're in a world where like you might have a huge fan base that might sell out a show for you in Melbourne, Australia. Right. And it's like not forgetting that globalization of it all when you're doing marketing, I think is important.
Definitely. And the last thing I want to touch on here is just kind of getting your opinion on the future of music marketing. So I think that you obviously have done a pretty good job of positioning yourself every time there is a big shift in the industry on kind of being on the forefront of it. What do you think is kind of, if you want to share, the next big thing with music marketing? What should we all be paying attention to? What is going to be the next big needle mover for artists in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question because I wonder about this myself too, to be honest, sometimes.
Right.
I think when I came into music, it was like SoundCloud, right? It was like just being on SoundCloud, getting popping on SoundCloud. And then we exited that era to an extent. And then Instagram, like blog pages became really big, right? Like if you're a rapper getting on @rap, our generation, like still big today, but like at that time it was like if you're on those early on, you were popping. And then it was a TikTok era where it was like, all right, you're like, early on TikTok and you're posting consistently, you could just blow up and go crazy. And now we're in this world, I feel like, where there's not actually one answer anymore. I feel like every artist can blow up from different sides of it. I think from my perspective, we're almost in a place where the playing field is leveled. Like there's not one specific thing that any artist can focus on anymore to like blow themselves up, quote unquote.
Right.
I think storytelling, and it sounds a little cliche, but storytelling, I think, around an artist and their brand is the reason a lot of fans buy in because they're overexposed to so many artists nowadays.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that has almost come back in a sense of like, what's the world around the music? Like, what's your fashion? How are you dressing? Like, what do you like? Who are you around? What do you like? What scenarios are you in, or environments? You know, and so I wouldn't say it's like a single thing or a one size fits all solution anymore. Like maybe kind of had been historically. Now it's like the artist has to really have a compelling story that can tie like there's a thread through all of their kind of narratives and posts. An artist that does this really well is Tizo Touchdown, for example. I'm sure y'all seen Tizo. Like, so has a nails in his hair. He's like always dressing crazy.
Right.
Always posts sticky notes when he's posting on his Instagram. I think artists like that are gonna be the ones that it might be a slower build because they're not like TikTok heavy or like, you know, running ads all the time. But I think the fans are more authentic when they do come through, and they'll show out in different ways.
Definitely.
That's kind of how I see it evolving.
For sure. And I just want to touch on one quick thing there. You know, I'm curious if you can share what proportion do you see nowadays of independent artists approaching a company like Symphony to market themselves versus whole labels coming in? Because I feel like what you're saying, which is correct, is that moving forward, it just relies a lot more on an individual artist's ability to market themselves, which is currently what we're already seeing a lot of right now. But I'm wondering, at Symphony, do you see a lot of independent artists come to use the platform, and like proportionally compared to a major label or an indie label, how many of those kinds of artists are you seeing?
Yeah, I want to say like our user base is like 80% indie artists and like 20% management companies.
Wow.
or managers themselves, or even labels, right?
Right.
I think it's because just like the ease of access to music creation tools and music distribution tools it tilts the game towards artists becoming artists. But the label system and just labels overall have always been people-driven businesses. And so it was like, you know, you have to hire more marketers if you want to sign more artists. Versus an individual artist, they can use the power of the internet to like grow themselves and get big however they want to.
Right.
So I think like the growth of independence is exponential, whereas the growth of label-signed artists is linear.
Right.
I think that kind of like area in between that is where I think we fit in perfectly, right? Like we'll build tools for labels to manage their workflows. I think it makes a lot of sense because they're spending money on marketing and want to do it more effectively all the time. But then the artists themselves that are on the ground don't necessarily have tools that make it just as easy. So that kind of middle ground in between where like we can work with labels and folks on that side, but also individual artists and provide them similar value or even more value because they're more independent, I think is how we're looking at it, trying to build it out from that perspective.
Definitely. Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Megh. I think it's been a really great conversation.
Appreciate you.
And I'm excited to see what happens with SymphonyOS in the future.
Let's do it. Let's blow up 2023.